Section 15 of Music by Ursula Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15, Beethoven. It was in 1787 that Mozart was asked to hear the playing of a promising young musician who had just come to Vienna, Ludwig van Beethoven. After performing what Mozart seemed to think was only a showpiece, Beethoven asked if he might improvise. Mozart, whose own playing was full of feeling and who cared only for beauty of feeling and not for display, was impressed by young Beethoven's improvisation and said, "Mark that young man, he will make a name for himself in the world." Beethoven did indeed make a name for himself, and people of the present day not only know his name, but probably his music better than they do the music of any other great composer. Ludwig van Beethoven, who attracted Mozart's attention, was born at Bonn in 1770. He had an unhappy childhood. His father, who was a singer in the chapel of the Elector of Cologne, was quickly aware of his son's talent for music, and from early years trained him with great severity. Ludwig was kept practicing while other children played games, and he would sit crying over the piano. On one occasion, he was roused from sleep when his father and a friend came back from a tavern and was made to play all night. By the age of 7, he was a good performer on the clavier and gave public concerts, and by the age of 11, he was so proficient on the organ that the court organist left him to do a great deal of his work when he had to be away. Beethoven was glad of the work, for his father drank, and the family depended more and more on this son whose music could earn money. He himself realized when quite young that any improvement in his circumstances and any hope of getting on in life could only come from unremitting work at his art. And his art was a release from the troubles of his home life. Ludwig was able to hear much good music in Bonn, for the orchestra there was famous and the greatest musicians of the day came to hear it. In Bonn, too, he made lifelong friends. Madame Breuning, who fostered his love of literature, and Count Waldstein, to whom one of his most famous piano sonatas is dedicated. But all the time his home made constant demands on him. First his drunken father, then the care of his 2 younger brothers. At last, in 1795, he was able to go to Vienna, which was the musical center of the world. One short visit he had paid there when he was 17, that time when he had played to Mozart, but then he had to hurry home because of the death of his mother. Now, after Mozart's death, he settled in Vienna permanently, and there he became famous. Various noblemen made friends with Beethoven, and he wrote much music for performance at their concerts and began the series of 9 symphonies that are now so well known. He made, in fact, a great position for himself in Vienna. His independence of character, his rough humor, his jokes, his outspokenness have all been described by contemporaries. His friends were devoted to him even if they feared his sudden bursts of suspicion, and strangers who were congenial to him found him in odd ways amusing as well as interesting, for he enjoyed life and society in his own way with great vitality. When he was 26, a great disaster came upon him. He had a dangerous illness which left him deaf. Reckless of his health and absorbed in music as he was, he could not ignore his deafness, which seemed the greatest physical ill that could come to an artist whose life and work depended on his hearing. In the year that he wrote the well-known sonata we call the Moonlight Sonata, he wrote to a friend, "What was most precious to me, my hearing, has been in great part lost. How sad my life is! I must now take refuge in the sadness of resignation." Beethoven, however, was not mute in resignation. He composed constantly, and it was about a year after this letter that he wrote the well-known violin sonata known as the Kreutzer, because it is dedicated to the violin player Kreutzer, who was a member of the household of Bernadotte, the French ambassador in Vienna. He also began his famous 3rd Symphony, now called the Eroica, written because he wished to express in it his admiration for the career of Napoleon. Before, however, the work was sent to Paris, he heard the news of Napoleon's taking the title of emperor. In his fury at this act, for his admiration of the great soldier had been founded on the belief that Napoleon stood for the fight against the power of kings and emperors, Beethoven tore off the title page and threw it to the ground. And when he published the symphony, he named it "An Heroic Symphony to Celebrate the Memory of a Great Man." He had realized, after 6 years of doctor's efforts, there was no hope that his hearing would improve, and he took refuge in writing works which he could hear in his head, if not with his outward ears. With Beethoven's work we find a new impulse in music, which is absent in the compositions of older musicians. We do not feel that it is beauty at which he is aiming in his compositions. That beauty was part of his aim and that he attained it is undoubted, but it was the expression of human longing, human effort, human moods, and human attainments of nobility and greatness that he first desired to express. And with this end in view, he did not scruple to strain the resources of music to their utmost. So he would write parts for the voice that were almost impossible to sing, and parts for instruments that were almost impossible to play, and nothing would make him alter a note. He took an immense time before he was satisfied with his work. Themes and passages would be written and rewritten in his notebooks, and once he felt they were perfect, he would alter nothing. He had great happiness in his life. Many times he fell in love, and several times hoped to marry, but some difficulty or some devotion to his music put an end each time to such plans, and he never married. It was at a time when he was in love that he wrote his one opera, Fidelio, and his best-known symphony, the Fifth, in C minor, was written soon after. Fidelio is a beautiful work, and if at times the action seems to flag while the music goes on, that music is so lovely that no one thinks of anything else, and no one would miss a note of it. Beethoven made a good income by his compositions, and 3 princes in Vienna gave him a yearly salary to enable him to live in Vienna with sufficient freedom to continue composing. He had a violent temper and an almost fierce spirit of independence. On one occasion, when in the company of Goethe, they happened to meet the court. Goethe politely took off his hat and waited for the Empress to pass. But Beethoven only raised his hand and strode through the party with his arms folded. As he afterwards said to Goethe, "You must let them clearly understand what manner of man you are. Princes can make a man a court counselor, but they can never make a Beethoven or a Goethe." In 1812, Vienna was suffering from the defeat of the Austrians by Napoleon. Taxation was heavy, everyone was poor, and money was worth so little that Beethoven's income was very small. However, during the Congress of Vienna, he met many of the monarchs who attended, among them the Russian Empress at the house of the Russian ambassador, Count Razumowski. The Empress gave him a present of £100, and he received other sums which he was able to invest, and thus be more at ease. One more trouble came into his life. His nephew Karl, one of Beethoven's brothers, died, leaving a little boy of 8. After battles in the law courts with the boy's mother, Beethoven was at last made sole guardian of the child. He devoted himself to this nephew and worked hard at composing so as to make money for him. He wrote his famous Mass and his last piano sonatas, more wonderful than any he had written before, and people now began to give him endless commissions, so that he wrote to his other brother, "People are fighting to get works for me." He was commissioned by a Russian Prince Galitzin to write 5 quartets. They are the last he wrote, and contain some of his most magic music. The Hammerklavier Sonata, as it is called, Opus 106, the piano sonatas that follow it, and these last quartets are indeed the most wonderful music Beethoven produced, greater in depth of feeling and in freedom of expression than even his well-known symphonies. Even now, their poetry of feeling is only fully understood by a few people. So far-reaching is their expression, and so far in advance of the time when they were written. When the Ninth Symphony was given for the first time, the applause was overwhelming. Never before had there been a symphony with not only orchestra, but voices in solos and chorus. Beethoven was present, but his deafness was so great he heard nothing, and he had to be turned around to face the audience and see them clapping their hands and waving their handkerchiefs. However, the symphonies and larger works did not bring him in money, so he devoted himself to the quartets he had been commissioned to write, and for which he was to be well paid. He was constantly anxious about his nephew. The young man failed at whatever career he tried. Finally, he tried to commit suicide and was taken in charge by the police. As well as this, daily life had many vexations for Beethoven. For lost in his music, he took no care of his personal appearance or the ordinary affairs of life, and his servants were a constant difficulty. If he became absorbed in what he was writing, he sometimes spent all day and all night alone, stamping up and down, roaring, shouting, spilling ink over the furniture as he wrote, sometimes pouring water over his hands until the floor was flooded. His deafness made him increasingly suspicious of friends who tried to help him, and his one resource was to write music and uplift himself from the troubles of his daily life and the constant anxiety about his nephew. Writing his last 4 quartets, he spent the last few months also planning to write a few more orchestral works, which he had sketched out and wished to finish. He was getting really infirm when his nephew was released by the police and had to leave Vienna. He went to stay with Beethoven's surviving brother. It was a household to which Beethoven himself had often refused to go. He and his brother had no common interests, and Beethoven disliked the wife. However, he went to be with his nephew. The house was cold and damp. No attention was paid to his growing ill health. And when he understood that he was to pay for the food and lodging he found so uncomfortable, he left, determined to take his nephew back to Vienna in spite of the police. The brother would not lend a close carriage for the first few miles of the journey, and Beethoven traveled in an open conveyance in cold winter weather. He arrived back in Vienna very ill from exposure. The nephew, who accompanied him, did not call in a doctor at first, and then fetched one who did not know Beethoven and did not understand what was the matter. For nearly 4 months his strong constitution battled with the disease of which he died. Meanwhile the nephew returned to his regiment, and Beethoven felt more at peace. He had quarreled with the doctor who best understood him, but in this last illness the quarrel was made up, and Dr. Malfatti again came and helped him to regain some of his old powers. He was in need of money for his nephew, and his thoughts turned to England and its generosity. To his delight, the Philharmonic Society of London sent him a sum of money, hoping to have the pleasure of fresh work of his composing. And Beethoven was so revived that he felt confident of sending them the symphony he had planned, but which he never wrote. A few days later he was much worse, and on March 26, 1827, while a storm of thunder and hail was raging, a crash of thunder and vivid flash of lightning roused him for a moment to hold his clenched fist up in the air. In a few seconds he fell back dead. His funeral was a wonderful scene. Alone as he had been so much of his life, on that spring day 20,000 people attended his funeral. Soldiers had to force a clear way for the hearse from the house to the church. Many well-known musicians followed the great master, among them Schubert, who was afterwards buried near him. Though Beethoven's music is well known, it is not the most original works that are known the best. The great works written at the end of his life and after the period of his greatest misery over ill health, money troubles, and his worthless nephew, these are the works that give most the vision of that beauty towards which he strove and which never seemed so clearly his as in these latest compositions. The feeling in the last piano sonatas and last string quartets is so poignant. The vision of a beauty outside and beyond a world of suffering is so vivid that in them Beethoven transcended the forms he usually accepted and wrote with a poetical breadth which is still touchingly moving and beautiful. Most musicians since Beethoven have considered that his work naturally falls into 3 periods. His earliest work was in the style prevalent at the time, the style used by Mozart and Haydn. From that he passed to the more fanciful piano sonatas, Opus 31, and his best-known symphonies, the Eroica, the Seventh, and the Pastoral. Then came the final period, when he wrote the late piano sonatas and quartets, and when lovers of Beethoven feel he produced his greatest works that showed not only how he could extend and change the accepted forms of music, but works that conveyed with extraordinary feeling the spirit of the composer, his courage, his suffering, his attainment of serenity in a world of beauty that seems unallied with this world, except that it wakes in our hearts when we hear it, the answering sympathy of feeling with his suffering and with the uplifted triumph of his courage. End of section 15 of Music by Ursula Creighton. Read by Martha Weller, Champaign, Illinois, March 7th, 2024.